This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
This episode makes heavy use of visual information shown in the full video.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 68. We're going to start with a question from Mark from California, who asks, why are arm and hand motions often linked to speech?
Well, to start, a bit of a review from a number of previous episodes. What's going on in your brain with language? In most people, 90% of people, language is centered in the left hemisphere. And as we've heard, two brain regions, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, are central to it. Wernicke's area, where most of language comprehension is happening. Broca's area, where language production is happening. And this is the standard picture. Language is localized to the left hemisphere, which has raised the question of what's going on in the equivalent areas in the right hemisphere. And what it took people a while to figure out is the right hemisphere is where you do prosody. The meaning you're communicating not with the words, but with the tone, with the pacing, with the intonation. And that's the whole world of like, oh, come in and where'd all the cookies go? Did somebody eat all the cookies? Did you eat all the cookies? The difference between saying, I would never eat all the cookies, probably didn't eat all the cookies, versus I would never eat all the cookies. Maybe yes, maybe no, versus I'd never eat all the cookies, ate the cookies. So what we see with prosody is that's communicating a whole lot that's working as a subtext in parallel with left hemispheric nuts and bolts of language production and comprehension. So what we've got here is just take this theme of prosody, verbal prosody, and extend it to what you're doing with facial expressions while you are speaking or while you are comprehending, and how that adds subtext. And then just extend it one step further into gestural stuff, what you're doing. And we all know just how important the gestural stuff is. That takes somebody, I know nobody actually ever does this anymore, but someone who is like talking on the telephone for a while and they're giving somebody directions. And while they're doing it, they're absolutely gesturing. So then you make a right and then you go, and they are doing gestural stuff in a circumstance where it is having absolutely no impact on the oral communication that's going on, showing just how like hardwired, how embedded gestural aspects are of accompanying spoken language. So of course it becomes interesting what's going on in the brain in terms of hand-arm gestures when speaking. And it's really tough to study because you can't put somebody in a brain scanner and study them while they're gesturing with their hands. That introduces too many confounds into it. It's very tough to do, but you could at least understand what gestural meaning is doing in the brain when someone is comprehending language. Sticking them in a brain scanner, and they are watching someone who speaks to them, with gestures, who doesn't speak, who speaks and does something completely random, like undoing the lid of a jar, dissociating the pure motoric aspects from the sort of gestural meaning aspects. And what you see is when you are watching somebody who is gesturing in a meaningful way, in a way that is facilitating the communication, you light up the right areas, the right hemisphere, equivalent to Wernicke's area. So that gives you a sense of what the gestural stuff is doing. So of course the question becomes, where in the brain is it happening? One of the big areas is this region called the basal ganglia, which is involved in motoric aspects of language. Some obvious parts: you're speaking, motoric, you're doing stuff with your lips and your tongue and your larynx. You're doing motoric stuff with normal comprehension. You lean in to hear better. You look in the direction of the sound. Or if you're an adorable golden retriever, you tilt your head while they're talking to you, and that causes them to stop and give you a treat. So motoric stuff with that. But the basal ganglia apparently also plays a role in the motoric aspects of hand gesturing when you are speaking. evidence for it. It is activating at those times. People who get damage to the basal ganglia, it's part of the brain that also connects into the cerebellum. People who get damaged there have trouble understanding gestural aspects of language. So we're having some idea of how it works. Of course, the question becomes, why do we gesture so much when we communicate? And the easiest one is on the level of what's the benefit to the recipient, the person you are communicating to. And it carries information. It carries information in tone and timing and pacing and the emphases you put on your hands. There's basically three reasons why people gesture in order to impart more information. One, in order to emphasize which are the important points. Two, because it's weird to emphasize just one point. And three, because things come in threes. That's why you do it. What you also see, much more interestingly, is gesturing also helps the person who's doing the communicating. And totally cool studies where they get people describing a scene and with or without being able to use their hands. How do you keep them from using their hands? In one study, very interestingly, very cleverly, they tied people's arms down to the chair. How did they get them to do that? They said, oh, we're going to be monitoring your blood pressure while you're speaking, so we need to have all this stuff wired up here. It was just to make sure people couldn't use their arms. And what you see is when people are speaking, when they're communicating, when they're trying to describe a scene, especially a scene with action, if you can't gesture along with it, people speak more slowly. They have more pauses. They forget the word they're looking for until they suddenly find it again, except they can't do it that way. You see more stumbling, less efficient transmission of communication. And at the other end, gesturing helps comprehension. Okay, so that's gesturing when you are speaking. And of course, superimposed on that is culture. And what you have thus is the same gesture can mean very different things in different languages. And thus, I looked this up. This gesture here I do with my brachydactyl fingers, which apparently, if you are communicating in Arabic, this means telling somebody to be patient, to hold your horses. On the other hand, in Italian, it means, what did you say? Whereas in Greek, it means, ah, that's perfect. I have absolutely no idea if that's what it means, or in fact, these are very rude gestures. But the main thing is what we're seeing here is gesturing while you're speaking is just an extension of the same punchline of prosody, verbal prosody, which is showing that you can be communicating simultaneously, the complexities of doing that to communicate both text and subtext.
Yeah, and not surprisingly, you see the equivalent challenge in American Sign Language, ASL, which I've studied some. It's obviously a gestural visual language. Sign languages are stored in the same parts of the brain as spoken languages, with primary coding in the Broca's and Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere, and as with spoken English, prosody in ASL is coded in the right hemisphere. There are certain rules in ASL that relate pretty directly to prosody, such as grammatical structures that are based around facial expression. In spoken English, you might say, that's a big dog versus that's a big dog, where you're increasing, the duration and the volume of big. In ASL, mouth shape is used to sort of indicate the equivalent of tone around size or intensity. So, like, versus. But like with spoken English, ASL prosody gets more complicated when you're doing something more subtle, like making a statement rhetorical. And in ASL, you could kind of intentionally break the rules of facial grammar for this. For example, let's say you're with a friend, somebody walks into the room who looks vaguely familiar, and you ask, who is that? And your friend is amazed that you don't recognize who it is. Who is that? Adele. In ASL, WH questions, who, what, where, usually involve lowering your eyebrows. So genuinely asking, who is that, would be, and then you violate that eyebrow rule in order to make the same exact signs rhetorical. So you raise your eyebrows instead. So, who is that? Adele. So, just as with spoken English, transmitting text and subtext at the same time can vary a lot in its complexity.
Yet another demonstration of how much language is about logical structure rather than about sounds or stuff you're doing with your tongue or your lips.
Next, Gabriel from Argentina says, I wanted to know whether animals tend to have the same kind of political systems, democracies, monarchies, etc., or if it varies a lot from species to species, and in that case, what's the most common one?
Well, it varies a lot, mostly as a function of ecosystem. But our immediate challenge is terms like non-human democracy or monarchy and stuff. What exactly does that look like? And what that immediately tosses you into is a lot of myths about leadership among primates. And of course, among male primates is right at the top of the list. What's the classic stereotypical picture of what alpha male non-human primateness is about? And it's typically with baboons, you have an alpha male, and he is amazing, and he is the leader, and he carries the burdens of the generation's expectations on his shoulders. He protects everyone from the predators, and he decides which direction they go in the morning to forage, and he leads the hunts, and he disciplines the kids when they're getting out of line, and he changes the light bulbs. And this was the dominant picture, which of course turned out to be gibberish. For example, leading a progression where everybody's going to forage in the morning each day. The males don't do it. The alpha male doesn't do it because, for one thing, he's clueless because he probably just joined the troop just a couple of years ago rather than grew up in it. Moreover, even if he had a good idea as to where they should go, he's so impulsive, he's likely to make a very bad decision with it. And third, the complete falsity of the notion of any baboon, let alone the alpha male, doing anything for the common good. Note the gesturing here. So what do you see instead? It tends to be older females who decide where everybody's going in the morning, and it's not because they are leaders. Older females, they've been around, they know this time of year, four valleys over in that direction, the trees are fruiting. They just get up in the morning and head off that way, and everyone figures it's a good idea to follow them, not leadership in the conventional sense. So amid those qualifiers, what do social structures look like in different primate species, and where does power, political power, come in? And you see a whole array going from animals who are solitary much of the time, like orangutans, animals who live in single pair bonded pairs, monogamous pairs. Gibbons are like that. Lemur monkeys in Madagascar are like that. Interestingly, with a female dominant system, more aggressive than males, bigger than males, you can have a pair bond like that embedded in what's called a cooperative breeding species. And these are South American monkeys like marmosets. You got a female and you got a male, and they're pair bonded and they breed with each other, and there's four or five other animals in the group. Who are they? The younger siblings of the females, the younger sisters of hers. Who else? The offspring of the pair, if they've been together for a while. And it's not the case where these two have to harass everyone to make sure nobody else reproduces. There's no harassment. There's just sort of a simple physiological rule. If you're the kid sister of this female and she's around and you smell her pheromones, you don't ovulate. Instead, what you do as a cooperative breeder is you take a different role. The term is you are a polyethist, which is very different from marmosets who are polytheists. Polyetheists, where there's separate reproductive rules and roles in different members of a group, and this is mostly for social insects. What's going on in the marmoset? The kid sister helps the big sister with her kids and increases her reproductive success there through kin selection, helping the reproductive success of her close relatives, social biology. Okay, so you've got cooperative breeders like that. Then you have the domain that gets the most sort of projection, which is species where you have a bunch of females who are usually related or at the very least have been together their whole lives, and a single male. And almost invariably, depending on the primatologist who's describing it, if the primatologist is male, they will refer to this as a harem structure, the one breeding male and all his females. And if it's a female primatologist, she will probably much more accurately describe it as this is an all-female group that tolerates one male being around for a while who does some breeding before he's kicked out and long forgotten, and some other guy shows up. So you've got a structure like that. Then getting more complex, you have single male, group of female groupings embedded into larger social structures. This is what you see in Hamadryas baboons. And then you get the absolute apogee of it all, multi-male, multi-female groups. And this is where you're getting into baboons with a group of 100 individuals in there, and various macaque monkeys, rhesus monkeys. And that is where you have fairly strictly delineated hierarchies. So this is where we get maybe the first whispers of monarchy versus, sort of democracy. Broadly, people refer to different non-human primate species having these multi-male, multi-female groups hierarchically as having either a despotic hierarchy or an egalitarian hierarchy. Despotic, top down. Baboons, you got the alpha male baboon. He is not showing wisdom or bravery or insight, but he is sure hogging all the best resources. And when there's a predator around, he's not protecting anyone except kids who he thinks is his kids. Otherwise, he's fighting to get the highest spot in a tree to get to watch what happens. You have top-down control. You have he, when he is in a bad mood, is able to displace aggression on anybody lower ranking. It is adversity rolls downhill. So you have a very monarchical system there. In contrast, you can have these multi-male, multi-female groups with hierarchies that instead are egalitarian or bottom up. And a way to describe this is, you got an alpha individual who throws a certain amount of weight around, but if they're being a real jerk, a whole bunch of subordinates get together as a cooperative coalition and trounce this guy and make him regret his monarchical sort of reflexes there. And you see this most excitingly in bonobos, where you've got this puzzle. Males are a little bit bigger than females, which normally tells you male dominance in the species, but you don't see male dominance. How come? Because it's a bottom-up egalitarian system. When males are being jerks, groups of females join together to beat up on the guy and get him to change his ways. In a recent nice paper, a group, Harvard and Max Planck in Germany, Martin Serbeck was the first author a couple of months ago, looking at bonobos. And when you see these cooperative coalitions of females beating up on somebody, 85% of the time, they're beating up on a high-ranking male who's getting a little bit too big for his britches. So you see all these different versions by which we are not playing out leadership or for the good of the group. We are playing out politics. Politics in the most ham-handed sense of who gets what, who gets to hog more of the resources. And this is the sense Franz de Waal, primatologist, amazing scientist, died last year, way too young, in one of his most famous books called Chimpanzee Politics, which was analyzing politics in this rawest sense of who gets to control the resources. And when you look at this, ranging from a pair bond, lemurs, the female has more of the resource control. In gibbons, it's more equal. When you've got the cooperative breeders, the marmoset breeding pair, they have control of the resources over everybody else. And you get to the big, complicated multi-male, multi-female species. And where are resources being divided? They're being hogged by whoever's most powerful. They're being shared along lines of relatedness. They're being shared along lines of reciprocity or stable cooperative coalitional behavior. So essentially what you see is a whole lot of variety, and maybe the same range of variety as in humans, and lots of interesting things as to why we get some social structures, some dominant structures in some types of primate species versus others as a function of what type of ecosystem. Desert versus rainforest versus snow now and then versus droughts, etc. Lots of variability there.
To wrap up, Jonah from Arizona says, Humans are usually not disgusted by their own body's secretions, waste products, or fluids, but another person's waste, saliva, mucus, blood, etc., can repulse us to no end, although this repulsion exists on a spectrum. What explains us being okay with our own yucky stuff, and what explains human variance in terms of being okay with other people's yucky stuff?
Oh, disgusting effluents from your body. Feces, urine, blood, sweat, saliva, vomit, pus, discharge, smegma, sebum, what else? Genital discharges, earwax, mucus, what else? Purulent discharges, and of course, milk coming out of your nose when you laugh so hard unexpectedly. All these things that could come pouring out of us. And a general rule is it's much more disgusting if it comes from someone else than from you. So where do we get our equanimity about our own body effluence? And the starting point is it's not that we have to acquire that. In fact, things go in the other direction. Kids do not find most anything related to the body to be disgusting. They do not have hardwired aversions to foul smells, things of that sort. Freud went wild with this, with the notion of polymorphous perversity in infants, that this was somehow a suggestion of infant sexuality, pre-genital sexuality. I'm not going to go anywhere near that. But what you see is as we develop, we begin to find other people's stuff to be disgusting, whereas ours is just fine. Now, the person who's done the most work with this is a guy named Paul Rozin, University of Pennsylvania, who is the king of the psychology of disgust. Really great guy, totally interesting research. And one of the things he starts off with is, so why are we like yucked out by other people's feces, urine, vomit, etc.? Because it may be pathogenic, it may be infectious, they may get us sick. And by that logic, your own feces, urine, what else, vomit is perfectly fine, because who's it coming from? It's coming from you. You know where it came from. It's not going to get you sick because it already came through you there. Ooh, somebody else's danger, Will Robinson. It comes from you. And this is just like a familiar old face that you've just thrown up. So the notion of contamination being less worrisome when it's coming from you. Of course, the problem there is like, okay, look at all of my fecal matter there. No worries, because I know it already has whatever intestinal parasites I've already had. Ooh, look at all my blood there. No worries. Actually, that is worrisome. So that doesn't hold consistently. Something else he emphasizes is when it's your stuff, you have time to habituate to it. It becomes more familiar, and eventually it could be sources of information. Ooh, I shouldn't have eaten that, or sources of prediction, or sources of great misplaced pride, or whatever. But of course, as Joan is emphasizing, it's not just your stuff is great and everybody else's is disgusting. It depends on who they are. There's us, them barriers with it. And you see fascinating examples of this. This was a paper a couple of years ago, preceding the National Academy of Sciences, very prestigious journal, and just this cool study taking a bunch of volunteers and saying, here, sniff this t-shirt. This t-shirt came from classmates of yours in your university versus this t-shirt came from somebody at your rival university, and rate the pleasantness or the unpleasantness of the smell. And what do you know, just thinking that this t-shirt's armpit smell is coming from someone from the hated enemy school, people rated it as smelling more disgusting, as more aversive. Another example of this was a great study some years ago, tapping into magical contamination, magical purity sort of thoughts. And this was giving people this thought experiment. Okay, here's a sweater. You can buy this sweater. This sweater was worn by JFK, John F. Kennedy. This was his sweater. How much would you pay for it? Or here's a sweater. It was worn by Bernie Madoff. People who don't know that history, Bernie Madoff, one of the all-time sociopathic Ponzi scheme crooks who stole billions and destroyed philanthropies with his actions and stuff. Here's Bernie Madoff's sweater. How much would you pay for it? And what you would see is, no surprise, people were much more interested in paying to get JFK's sweater than Bernie Madoff's. But then the twist, saying, aha, this sweater came right off of JFK. How much would you pay after we've washed it? And people would pay less. They somehow want the magical armpit cooties from JFK that's transmissible in some way. On the other hand, Bertie Madoff's sweater, yeah, I wouldn't pay much for it, but if you washed it in bleach and in toxic whatevers, yeah, then I would pay more for it. So the disgustingness of it varying as a function of who's the source of the distressing stuff. And of course, not only in addition to whose stuff you're evaluating the disgustingness of, yours or one of theirs, it's who's evaluating it. And this is one of the great, interesting findings that I want to cover at some point, which is on the average, when you look at social conservatives and social liberals, not what you want to do with the economy, not what you want to do with the trade deficit or whatever, but just, is it okay that things like this should be allowed? Should this be legal? Social conservatives versus social liberals. On the average, social conservatives have a much lower threshold for being disgusted by things. You show liberals and conservatives pictures of some festering wound with like dung flies all over it, and how much does their stomach lurch? How much does their galvanic skin resistance, a measure of their sympathetic nervous system change? How disgusting does the person rate it? On the average, social conservatives are more easily disgusted by things than social progressives are. And all sorts of stuff plays out from that, including studies like showing social conservatives have more cleansing products in their bathrooms on the average than social progressives. A lot of it tapping into this metaphorical theme of sensory disgust leads to moral disgust judgments and confusion with that. And before you know it, ooh, because they're different, they're disgusting, and it's wrong, wrong, wrong. Okay, so all that variability there. So, of course, what it comes down to is it's not just you and your own fluids versus the rest of the world on a continuum, as Jonah said, but what sort of information is contained in the people who are close to you on that continuum. And bodily fluids being a very good index of just how connected you feel with some individual. Just you wait, those of you who have not had newborns, until your newborn shows up, and not only are you unperturbed by their poop and their diapers, you think it's the most wonderful, fragrant, just luxuriant poop you've ever seen in your life. There's some sort of ego boundary thing, and this can extend in all sorts of nutty directions. Like over the holidays, we had someone visiting us who brought a dog along with our dogs, and we discovered a puddle of pee on the floor. And it was very important to me knowing who supplied the pee, which dog, not because I was going to like start handing out blame, but I wanted to know how grossed out I should be between cleaning up our dog's urine, which was just a vacation to do that, versus this foul canine who had peed on our floor. How disgusting it is varies as a sense of pseudo kinship. But then beginning to find somebody else's bodily fluids less disgusting is one of the things that begins to mediate intimacy. Okay, great example of this. I have no idea if this ever actually has occurred in a movie, but this seems inevitable, that some American graffiti sort of movie where our protagonist in 1950s is out on a date with their gal or with their feller, and it's going great, and they go over to the malt shop where old Doc is behind the fountain and order a ice cream float with 2 straws there, and our protagonist drops the straw at some point, and the date says, oh, that's okay, we can share. Aha, a boundary has just been crossed in terms of sharing bodily fluids. I don't know what base that averages out to during Eisenhower era America, but it speaks to, half of what adolescence is about is the desire to share bodily fluids with someone else. So that could be a marker of growing intimacy. And a great recent study showing infants understand this. This was work done out of Harvard and MIT, looking at infants, looking at toddlers. How do they figure out who is most closely affiliated with who? And in a circumstance, for example, where they're watching three puppets and they interact in various ways, and then the puppet in the middle has some sort of challenge. There's something too heavy for the puppet to pick up. And if it's a toddler, you ask them, okay, which other puppet is going to help them? Which one should help them? Which one has some social contract with them? Which one is closer to them? If it's a preverbal infant, what you just say is, oh no, who's going to help the puppet in the middle? And you look where their eyes go. They're telling you the same thing, who they consider to be more connected with the individual in the middle. And what are the criteria that infants and toddlers use? You watch your puppets eating if they share utensils. That's a signal that they're more closely connected. So this is the one who should come to the aid of that one. If they're eating ice cream and they lick the same ice cream cone, in other words, infants already know intuitively that sharing bodily fluids and saliva dripping from that person's fork is just fine if they're close to you. Infants have this as a hardwired rule for how do you detect intimacy in other members of your species? And the answer is if they're sharing bodily fluids, which is very cool. So that's how this works.
And that is episode 68. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.